Hello, everyone. Welcome back for another positive talk. Super excited to be doing these again. I had a little bit of a break, but I'm excited to be back. Getting super close to episode 300, which is crazy. Never thought that this series would be making it as far as it has, but I'm super excited for where they have taken me, as well as where I plan on taking them in the future. So definitely stay tuned for that. Make sure you're checking out all the ones I've done in the past that I've put on my website, which is drummondculture.com. We'll get started. Hello.
Hello, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm so good.
Great to hear. Trying to adjust my camera. I'm sitting in a new place today because our AC stopped working.
No.
So I'm trying to sit somewhere where I'm not boiling up.
Yes.
So
I feel your pain. I kind of made a weird arrangements because I moved into a new place just yesterday.
okay.
So I'm not used to working also where I'm at.
Love it. Awesome. Well, I will let you introduce yourself so people know who you are, and then we can kind of jump into our conversation.
Awesome. Sounds good. Yeah, so my name is Ian Black, and I am currently in California, and that is because I'm about a year into pursuing a career as an actor, performer, dancer, singer, all of those things. But when I went to undergrad, I went to Bible school, so I felt called into full-time ministry. And for college, I was in Chicago and studied there, and then jumped into ministry. And I actually served for 11 years as a pastor, a nice variety, sometimes worship ministry, sometimes student ministry, teaching teams, all that good stuff. And then we'll talk through all the things that changed, but for a variety of reasons, ended up making a big leap. So I'm originally from Chicagoland. Stayed there for college, stayed there for the beginning of career, and then this past year made a big shift.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm all for big shifts. I've done quite a few of those in my lifetime, so
I
think
bet.
the conversation should be fun because I've lived in 9 different states now. I got to live in Chicago for a little bit for an internship that I was doing. So,
And please tell me you loved it, because there is no city like Chicago. Oh.
so I loved Chicago during the summer during my internship. When I went back to visit in the winter, I flew from Florida up there, so
Yeah.
my hydrated Florida skin did not enjoy the cold winter of Chicago.
That is understandable. A quick factoid, do you know why Chicago is called the Windy City?
I do not.
So everybody thinks that it's because of the weather. So as you mentioned, it gets freaking cold, and people think it's just the wind tunnels, especially coming off the lake. But Windy City ties to just the history of corrupt politics, where the city goes where the wind blows. And so it has nothing to do with the weather. And everyone thinks that it has to do with the weather.
Well, as windy as it was up there during the winter, I can see why people would get confused because
Exactly. It's fair.
I'd never gotten windburn before.
Ooh, yeah.
And that's worse than any type of sunburn I've ever gotten because no matter what temperature you went into, once you had windburn, it just hurt. So I was just
Correct.
very thankful for getting back down to Florida when I did.
I'm very, very glad that at least you got to experience the beauty that is Chicago in the summer. That's what can warm our hearts.
Yeah, it's definitely a beautiful city. I was used to going to New York City because I'm on the East Coast, so of course, and then I've been to LA. And comparing those 3 cities, which are probably the largest ones I've been in, Chicago was surprisingly the cleanest that I was in. So I was very impressed with how clean it was. Because in New York City, if you walk around with white tennis shoes, you're coming home with black ones.
Correct. Yes, you're right. Those are the 3 biggest in the country. I think Houston is next. And yeah, I think walking in LA and New York, though I love both of those cities, is nothing compared to Chicago. Nothing.
Yeah. Well, since you are traveling a lot now, so what type of traveling have you gotten to do so far since you decided to pivot in career choices?
Yeah. So my approach, especially having seen so many of my actor friends who are based out of New York, They're kind of my window into what theater was when I was still a pastor. And I would watch them while being based in a city, often travel to regional theaters. So for myself, trying to be, I guess, like realistic and especially, entering the acting game a little later in life, I figured, well, that's what I need to do. Instead of just making the New York leap or the LA leap, I'm going to bounce. And so Indianapolis is kind of my home base. And it's because I served 6 years in a church there. My closest community is there. But I sold my house several years ago. I have no lease. So I am completely a free nomad who bounces for theater contracts. As of now, it has been either just Indy or San Diego area.
Okay.
So this past year, I've bounced back and forth. So Christmas in Indy with the symphony, January through March here with the theater, back to Indy for a show. Now I'm back here for two. Next spring, I'll be south of Atlanta for a show there. I'm glad that already came together. So we're bouncing time zones. I don't think I've had anything in mountain time since I left Denver. So just bouncing between Pacific time and East Coast time.
Yeah. I have a friend who's in the traveling show for Wicked,
Nice.
and him and I connected when I was actually in Indianapolis. He was dating someone that I was friends with, and then we connected. I'd never seen Wicked, but I was in show choir growing up, so I was very familiar with the music.
Of course.
So he was bouncing around all over the place. He was supposed to be in North Carolina right as the pandemic hit. I was supposed to go see him perform there. And then, of course, that shut down the show for a little bit. Thankfully, they came here right to Richmond, where I'm living now, so I got to see him perform and hang out while he was here in the area.
That's so great.
It's definitely a lifestyle, and it's one that I feel like a lot of people don't understand. Like, he, of course, is in a show where he's got like a permanent position for now. So that's a little different than jumping from show to show because, I mean, while you're performing and doing that, you know when an end date may be coming and then needing to figure out what's next. That's
correct. No, and that's a good distinction because, yeah, lots of people who end up doing a tour, it'll often be longer. It's a great way to save up money because your cost is just less. Thankfully, when you bounce regionally, you often can get put up. So like I'm not paying for my housing here, which is great. But I think that's a good point. Like people don't understand. I did not understand. And I don't think it's for everyone. I think for me, it's going to be a chapter. I can envision probably as soon as next calendar year, picking a big city to at least home base out of again. Partly for your own soul, partly for your own, just say like peace of mind. But one thing I do love about, we'll just say traveling for work period, is how it simplifies some things, so you have what you have with your luggage, you have limited maybe friends in the area. And so as opposed to the beauty of being planted, which I think there's a lot of beauty in being planted in one place for a long time, and I've experienced it. But the beauty of traveling is like sometimes decisions are just made for you. You are prompted to get to explore. You get to meet lots of new people who are fascinating. It definitely is not for everyone, and I don't think it'll be for me forever. But I'm loving this season.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to what you were talking about, when it comes to being like forced into some decisions, I think that's a helpful thing. I moved because I was forced into some decisions. And it's kind of nice to be forced into things. I know that for me personally, when it came to my coming out experience, that was kind of a forced experience. I look back and I wonder, had I not been forced, how long I would have stayed hidden in secret. So as much as it sucks to be pushed to make a decision in that way, to tell people about a very personal part of myself, I was grateful for it. And I tried to like shift perspective of this gave me an opportunity to be my most authentic self and learn about that part of myself. Because when I was hiding it, it was something that I spent so much energy like pushing out that I wasn't really living life. So like when it comes to being forced into things, sometimes if you allow your mindset to look at it in a positive way, it
Hmm.
can be something that is really helpful and will help you learn some more things about yourself.
Absolutely. Well, I love, we can circle back to your example just because we relate there and it's such a huge part of life. It's a really good example. But yeah, I think even maybe the mundaneness of day-to-day routines and schedules. So like if you work a normal 9 to 5 job, that's great. But oftentimes you've got that chunk of the day set and then other responsibilities, social life, church life, whatever, that's where the evening goes. The performer schedule is rarely like that.
Yeah.
And so you have to constantly adjust. And yeah, the decision is made where like, I don't get to have a social night or a social life in the evenings, basically ever.
Yeah.
You kiss it goodbye. So then you're like, well, what do I do during the day? And that's where it comes into like your own disciplines. Will I be in the gym? What are my part-time jobs? How do I also, though, still do good soul care, Sabbath, rest, silence and solitude, which I'm a big fan of, time with friends, even if perhaps you barely have any friends, you know where you're at. But yes, being forced into things is a good challenge. I love it.
Yeah. I mean, when it came to my mindset, when I had like a schedule that was kind of all over the place, like week to week, it was never the same. I had the mindset that if I were to have a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 job, that it would be easier to orchestrate things like hanging out with friends
Hmm.
and creating life. And then I got that, and it was still just as problematic. It was just the mindset had to shift. And it was something that I was like, oh, well, I'll have my weekends open and I'll finally be able to do stuff with friends.
Hmm.
Come to find out, weekends are just as busy for my friends.
Uh,
So
uh,
when it came to orchestrating, it just meant you had to plan things, and the people you care about and want to see,
hmm.
you put the extra effort into doing that.
Because there's no
It's,
natural overlap. Yeah.
yeah. And it's just, you have to make something happen if you want it to happen. And
100%.
that's what I always tell people when it comes to coaching. I'm like, if you want something in your life, you will work to get it there. Like
Hmm.
it's not something that you're just going to magically accumulate just because you hope for it. Like you have to
Correct.
intentionally put it
Mhm.
there.
And even though I'm sure everybody knows the cliche already, but fighting the mentality of the grass is always greener. And I'm so grateful I'm going to basically say for 10 years of my life, I lived a basic white girl suburban life. And the thing is, I loved it. It was so satisfying, like being in ministry, loved it. Being planted, loved it. But now what I'm experiencing is something so different. It's something I've wanted. And you quickly realize there's pros and cons of both. But I'm grateful for 10 years of having experienced also a lot of probably what culture pushes us towards, or at least when you grow up in the burbs. And then everyone's like, well, you're going to come back, settle, work a good job, get married, have kids. I mean, just that expectation. And so having done at least part of that, not all of it, but part of it, loved it. But now to make a change, that's been really helpful. It also gives me a lot of respect for people who come either right out of high school or right out of college into the theater world, because they go from something that's kind of very set for them, and then they just have to navigate all of this change and all the decisions. And I don't know if I would have been able to do that at this age or at that age, but thankfully at this age, I know what I said goodbye to. I know what I'm embracing and why. And it's very helpful.
So when it comes to comfort and having 10 years of something that is a little bit more predictable than your current lifestyle, I know that a lot of people in general, when you find a certain area where you find comfort, where you just kind of know what to expect day to day,
Mhm.
how do you make that pivot to, I'm going to go from 10 years of kind of knowing how things work
Yeah.
to doing something I do not know anything about. Maybe I've heard some things from friends, but I'm ready to take that leap into this new chaos of new and undiscovered time for yourself.
Great question. You know, and like anyone, I think I've learned a lot, even about myself with the rear view mirror, vantage point. So I would say there were several years at the end of my time in ministry where things were starting to shift a little bit internally.
Hmm.
Part of it was simply getting more opportunities to do what I'm doing now. So as much of a risk as it is, I think a lot of people, if they're considering making a massive change, well, a great thing to do is test it out.
Yeah.
Maybe don't make the huge decision until you have tested it out, whatever that looks like. So that was part of it. I was performing professionally one time a year. So we'll say 2 months out of 12 for several years. I was getting a taste of what I wanted to do. Then I also think my heart was shifting where I still loved caring for people and still loved so much of why I was in ministry. But when you're a pastor, you end up spending time around people who are already Christians. And that's great. There's a place for shepherding, people who are Christians. But I've always had that desire where I'm like, well, I want to share Jesus with people who would never, ever cross foot or cross step into a church. So again, that's a little more personal to my example, but to get to be around a totally different crew was really attractive to me. But then I'll be honest, I made a big leap from one church to another church. And that was where I felt like I already had said a lot of goodbyes. I sold my house. I said goodbye to a community that knew and loved me, made the leap for something that I always thought would make sense. It ended up being such a poor fit that the risk to do what I'm doing now all of a sudden seemed not so scary anymore. I really do think, I don't know if I would have jumped into theater from where I was 2 years ago, but then when I think of where I was just a year ago, all of a sudden that risk, while still scary, terrifying, exhilarating, all the things, you just saw, okay, the path was being laid to be able to make that leap, and I wouldn't have done it sooner. So
Yeah. So it sounds like you took a risk, and then the discomfort that you felt in that risk made it a little easier to jump again.
mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes that's what it takes. I know that for me, when it came to some of the jumps that I was taking, they, they were really big jumps,
Yeah.
and I had to reassess quickly and just be like, okay, why am I not enjoying this right
Mm-hmm.
now? Is it
Yeah.
just the discomfort of it being new, or is this just not where I'm meant to be? And there was a lot of things because I was going through self-discovery along the way as well. So sometimes it's hard to untangle all of that from
Yeah.
like, okay, I've moved so much
Mm-hmm.
and I've grown as a person, but like what parts of me are the parts that I want? What parts of me are like the real authentic, or what I've become
Mm-hmm.
because I thought that's what I needed to exist in this
Yes.
space. But it was a journey, and I had to kind of realize, okay, the things that I was brought up on, like you were talking about faith, like that's something that's still very much to the core of who I am as a person. So, and being in the LGBT community, that was a struggle to find how those two could connect.
Right.
And because being vocal about my LGBT status within the religious realm of things, I got a lot of pushback.
What? It was challenging? What?
Being,
Oh my God.
being a part of any type of religious background
Yeah.
and being in the LGBT community, there was also a lot of pushback. And I was in this space where I was being told by everyone that I couldn't be who I was.
Mm-hmm.
So it took me putting my foot down and saying, I am who I am, and you don't get to tell me what I get to do in my life.
Yes.
And I think that that's one beautiful thing. You kind of mentioned it earlier, where there's a lot of people who kind of follow a similar path set, where it's like you go to school, you get the job, you find your partner, you get married, you have kids, and that's how the life is supposed to go.
Mm-hmm.
For me, early on, like all this structure of people telling me what the next steps were didn't feel right.
Yeah.
So I took steps outside of what I was being told was what everyone's supposed to do.
Uh-huh.
And that kind of freed me from the mindset of I have to do what everyone else is doing, or I have to follow the directions being told to me by these other people. And in that, I stepped into the unknown and found a lot of comfort there. I was like, I get to make the rules here, and I get to take my identity that I believe is me, and grow that and heal it from any traumas that existed.
Because they do.
And then I created my life the way that I wanted it to be. And like you, I also really enjoy serving people. I believe that putting love out into the world is the biggest way to bring people back to understanding God's message.
Absolutely.
And there have been places where I'm like, I don't really feel welcome here. I'm going to walk over here and kind of do my own thing. And I found a lot of peace in that.
Yes, 100%. The amount of self-discovery that, of course, takes place when you are risking is unreal. I think we both learned so much about ourselves. And yeah, what's to kind of pivot to that realm of discussion, I have been planning on coming out at a church, and I had an idea of what I wanted to look like. And to some of the church's credit, they were willing to walk that out with me. Granted, it was going to be in a certain vein, but I'm appreciative of that. It's a risk for an organization to kind of stand behind you. So I can appreciate that. But again, in hindsight, I mean, I only came out publicly in April. So what, 3 months ago? And the ability to do that while not formally working in a church has been so freeing. And the funny thing is, it had just never been on my radar because I'd never figured that I wouldn't work at a church.
Yeah.
And so to find myself where, to your points, like I get to then build the sort of community I want around me, which is still going to be a community of faith, but people who are willing to ask tough questions, you know, because the pat answers just don't cut it. They don't cut it for anybody. And I think my approach to that realm, both for myself and as a pastor, especially a pastor of young people, had always been, I kind of would steal from all my medical drama viewing the oath, right, of like, do no harm. And I was like, that's so helpful in that realm because people will disagree, especially in faith circles, of how we should respond as members of the LGBTQ community. And the disagreements of how we should respond don't bother me because I think there is, though, then an umbrella of like, but we cannot be doing harm. Also, thank you to that person who congratulated me. Thank you. Feels great. But yeah, the do no harm has been such a helpful lens because I think our broader culture, if I totally generalized, doesn't think that certain convictions are valid in any way, even if it's just a deep personal conviction that someone wants to live out and they're not forcing on anyone else. Like sometimes broader culture says absolutely not. Church culture, generally speaking, can be guilty of the opposite, where it's this narrow, like it must be this and nothing else. And so I find it helpful to operate with other people, especially if I'm going to counsel them, I'm going to give advice, and simply lay out options to your points of like, what do you need to do to care for yourself? What do you need to do to surround yourself with people who love you? And that lens of do no harm has been so helpful, both as a leader and then for myself. You know, I chose to not engage with a couple of conversations this spring that were kind of thrust upon me because I just knew my soul was not ready. And it was hard. There were repercussions that were difficult because of that. But I was like, I cannot engage with some of it right now because it will just, you know, rip me apart on the insides. So that's what we do sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, it took me a long journey of stepping away from the Christian organizations. I never stepped away from my religious beliefs. I just stepped away from organizations, the structural buildings of things.
Yes.
And it wasn't until I learned to love myself and accept that my journey, I'm here for a reason. I decided I was strong enough to go back and have conversations because anyone who's new to being part of the community and on the journey of self-love, self-acceptance, understanding one's identity, like a lot of times you are hit with questions that are really hard to answer. And I was like, you know what? I'm someone who I've done a lot of self-discovery. I've done a lot of self-growth and work on myself.
Yeah.
I will go into spaces like you were saying, you went out of the church to find people. I went back into the church to find people because I knew that the people at the church were probably never going to come to spaces to understand the LGBT community on a better level. So I decided to go back into churches and
Hmm.
be someone who told my story
Yeah.
and shared what I've learned, because we're always learning. The
Hmm.
LGBT history and everything is so much to learn. I'm
Hmm.
forever digging deeper into understanding the journey of this community throughout history.
Oh
But
man. Yeah.
it's very interesting to go back into a space where once upon a time I felt like I was so small and I was being crushed,
Hmm.
to I'm going back into this space amongst people who just need space to understand something better.
Hmm.
Uh, I do have to do a lot of work going into those spaces, because I know I can do harm if I am not mentally prepared for that.
Hmm. Yeah.
So it's not something I do every single day on repeat,
Yes.
because it is taxing on your energy.
Raining. Yes.
But I go back in and I connect with people, because I've found that what people don't know creates fear, and fear creates hate. And if
Hmm.
I can go in there and shed some light and educate and help people see
Hmm.
a community that doesn't really have a face to them,
Hmm.
I hope that that can kind of help merge some people's minds into like where they throw love, and getting rid of a lot of the things that can be considered hate
Yeah.
to the LGBT community.
Absolutely. I really love how you basically identified two different veins of accomplishing the same goal of loving people well. And yeah, I think it sounds like maybe, broadly speaking, we've swapped, because what you described, I do feel like was so much of my experience in the church as I would open up to people. But it's kind of like there's that direct and indirect way of helping love the LGBTQ community well. And that direct one being by just the interpersonal relationships we have with each other, and then the indirect way of helping people outside of that community have exposure, understand, safe space to ask questions, which is so much of what you're doing. And thankfully they're not diametrically opposed, and where we can't be involved in both. Thankfully life is not not like that.
Yeah,
But yes, we get pulled perhaps one direction or another, and I'm loving being able to, yeah, just be amongst, again, yeah, people who probably don't ever want to, be around the church folks. And I love that you're like, oh, I'm going to help the church folks grow, because, yeah, like the ripple effect from that is actually bigger. And I found a lot of satisfaction in the past about that. It's where I'm like, if you help, and we'll just call it what it is, if you help straight people, especially straight Christians, understand, then that ripple out is huge. And I've seen that play out.
yeah. I mean, it's all about planting seeds,
Hmm.
and even if you leave that space not seeing any type of growth, you can just hope that someone else will be the water, someone else will be the sun to
Hmm.
help grow that love and acceptance in a community that
Exactly.
is just there existing. I mean, we can't. I've lived so many different places where it's very rural, it's very closed minded, they've been the same since the beginning of time. Um,
It's
and they just
immutable,
follow
right?
this very structured way of doing things. And sometimes it just takes someone brave enough to say, hey, there's other things out there.
Right.
And being someone who's been planted in lots of different spaces,
Hmm.
and uprooted and plant myself somewhere else where things are done differently, I myself had to learn that the way I do things here in Virginia
Hmm.
is not the same in Chicago, in Florida, and
Yep.
Pennsylvania, and New York. So I myself had to overcome the you're not always right. The
Hmm.
way you're brought up is just one of many.
Right.
And just because someone's doing it differently than you doesn't make it right or wrong.
Hmm.
It just makes it different, and that's okay.
When it's encouraging, if we think back, no matter where we've been, especially if we have bounced around, I've had to process a little bit when I've served in a church, where you pour yourself out for people, and then perhaps for any number of reasons in the departure, you lose some relationships. That's sadly so common in church transitions. And it happens for a million reasons. So that's really weighed on me, because then you ask yourself, well, what did I do wrong? What could I have done differently? But I am comforted when I consider, even if the relationship is not the same, that what we did in those moments does still remain. So some of that which was taught, some of that which they might have caught from us, or even just exposing people to new ideas, it's still there. And it's fun because years later, I've had people reach back out and talk about, hey, like I learned this from you. And my mind is like blown because I'm like, that's amazing. And it's just basically real life. I think whether people are in ministry or not, that doesn't matter. Like that is just interpersonal, life on life stuff that anyone can find satisfaction in. So when someone reaches back out and says like, hey, I learned this from you and I just wanted you to know, that to me is so life-giving and it's so worthwhile. And again, when it's towards the right end, helping people love others well, like that's what it's about.
And we never know, like you touch so many lives everywhere
Mm-hmm.
you go. Like it may be as small as doing something like opening a door for someone,
Mm-hmm.
but like most of the time, even with doing stuff like this on a live where there's tons of people watching, most of the time you don't have every single individual messaging you, letting you know how it's impacted them or
Right.
what thoughts it provoked.
Mm-hmm.
And when people do share those types of things, it's really special. I've had several messages where I'm just like, wow, that's a really powerful takeaway from what
Yeah.
I said. I'm glad because before every positive talk, just ask to have the right things said during the
Mm-hmm.
live because
Love that.
I
Yeah.
don't want anything to be taken the wrong way. I've
Yeah.
tried very careful to educate myself well enough to where everything I'm saying is loving, is positive, is helpful, but there's always that risk that something that you say can sit on someone's shoulders, and I don't want to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
But so far, it's been a very nice journey, and I know standing in front of a congregation like that's a very similar feeling, like wanting that message to touch people and send them out from church to the
Mm-hmm.
world to do good.
No, well said. Yeah, because when you said that, I was like, oh, I think I've prayed that prayer before preaching. And lots of pastors do. I mean, obviously in that context, it would be something to the effect of like, Lord, help me not say something that is outside of, your word, outside of your bounds. And if I would say it, will you cause it to fall on flat ears? But it is true. And anytime we're communicating with people, we should at least be cautious and sober minded that like, hey, even with the best of intentions, which I don't know about you, I can't even say I always have the best of intentions, for just being honest. But even when they're there and the motives are pure, that there might be an inadvertent miscommunication, something's received from someone differently. And so, yeah, to be able to be really mindful of it. And I'm glad that you've been so encouraged by some of the feedback that you get.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
I mean, when it comes to the conversations that I've had, I go anywhere the conversation goes. Like I do not stray away from it. If I'm uncomfortable, I'll
Yeah.
let people know, hey, like there's a lot of discomfort in this, but I'm willing to talk about it because I think that a lot of the uncomfortable things are the things we really need to be talking about.
Yeah.
And being someone who grew up very religious, very conservative, for me, the struggle that I faced was just anything that seemed more promiscuous was really hard for me
Yeah.
to talk about. And there were times where I created content that I was really uncomfortable creating.
Yeah.
And then I took the feedback because I was looking at it and I was like, okay, I shared why I was uncomfortable. I shared my thoughts and beliefs around this topic, and it helped someone, and it was worth it. But there's still times where I go back and see something, and I'm like, ugh, I'm still cringing at the fact that this conversation was something I did.
Don't worry, we all got our cringeworthy moments. That's why, like, I hesitate to go back and look at maybe like a sermon or a blog that I would have written like 8 years ago. I'm sure it was very well meaning, and I actually probably largely would believe similar things.
Yeah.
But perhaps, the vehicle might have changed. Any number of things might have changed. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, with someone having a YouTube channel, like, of course, all of that stuff kind of stays there. And it's something that I hope when people see that they look below it and say, oh, this was something said in 2014.
Uh-huh.
So this is younger Drummond at an age that this is the way he was thinking.
Yep.
Let's look at the content being made now and see where he's grown. Because I think in today's world, with the access to pretty much everyone's life who shares stuff on the internet, sometimes you have to put it into the reference point of where it was said,
Yes.
that time frame, and give that person permission to grow from that experience. I think if you confront someone and they show that they have no desire to grow, you can confront them with a little stern voice and hand on that. But if that person has grown, like, be a little bit more open-minded, because I mean, there are definitely videos where I was talking about things where I'm just like, ooh,
Yeah.
I was very naive there, but I've learned a lot. And
Yeah.
I appreciate people who call me out on areas that I need to grow more in. And I'm willing to do that growing.
Absolutely. Well, and that is just reality, and I know we have to culturally remind ourselves of that. But if any of us want to be able to speak into anything, and if any of us want to be able to grow, especially if it is going to be more public, then yeah, like, we have got to be able to show grace to each other when we flat out misstep and or just shift a little bit, we grow. Because yeah, without that, and it is funny, I wish we could be better just as people of recognizing when things that are in a gray area versus things that are black or white. And it seems like so much of life is never black or white. It is always somewhere in the middle. And yeah, just this harshness. And I think it is because of distance or looking at things on the screen, where we forget, like, there is a soul behind there, and there's a living, breathing person there. We should be careful with how we, interact with that. But yeah.
It's interesting because during the pandemic, I joined an app called Clubhouse, which gave you access to just like speaking. It was an audio app, and you got to just talk to people from all over the world. And for the first time, like, I think we were all in the space identifying as humans trying to survive a global pandemic. And we were speaking to each other and being fascinated by the way different parts of the world were handling this global pandemic.
Gotcha.
And we were speaking to one another as people, and we weren't speaking to one another as labels of geographic location. So it was very interesting because I made so many friends globally. But as we're falling away from the global pandemic, it almost seems like we're falling into our own fears and own problems that exist because of location or whatever else divides us. And we're starting to forget that, once again, we're all human beings on the earth. We are surviving life together as a race, as a species. And I think that it's important for people to realize that when it comes to life, it wasn't just when the global pandemic hit that we had something in common. We're all living beings. And that's something that we tend to forget sometimes until things kind of affect us all on a level where it's like, hey, you're all on the same team. You got to figure it out together.
Yeah. This is perhaps too big of a question, but a question I want to pose, because I've observed some of those same things, though I did not get to have that exact pandemic experience, is if we do think back 2 to 3 years, there is such a corporate consciousness of things that we wanted to learn. And it could be anything from, let's learn the lesson of, hey, being overly scheduled and overly busy is not making us happy and joyful. There's just like consciousness of, like, we can pause sometimes. And then all the way to, yes, how we interact with people. So there's all these ideal lessons to be learned. We were given the chance. And my take on it is, like, not only did we not learn the lessons, but I actually think we have digressed. It is getting worse. Like, we returned to our old normal and then some. My question is, what is behind that? Like, why do you think, broadly speaking, we did not learn the lessons that we could have learned? And what is that?
I think it's comfort in what is known and the fear of the unknown that holds people in spaces of like, you know what, it's not too uncomfortable to be
Hmm.
in this space, and the risk of losing any type of comfort by moving into something completely different
Yeah.
scares people to sit in spaces that aren't the best for them. And I
Mhm.
think just creating that knowledge for people, I don't think that we celebrate different. I don't
Mhm.
think we celebrate unknown and learning as much as we do standardizing and telling people what they should be.
Mhm.
Um, Different is not celebrated in the world.
Right. Yeah.
Usually, the people who are different are, they usually have to step through a lot of hatred and attack first,
Mhm.
and then once they have created something of success or of value to the world, then they're
Right.
celebrated.
That's what
Uh,
happens. Yes.
so it's like you have to first put yourself through the hell of removing yourself from the standard
Hmm.
that everyone tells you you have to exist in. And then once you've proven that there's something better than what is currently existing,
Hmm.
then people will start jumping ship. So I think that there wasn't enough jumping
Hmm.
into like, hey, we found something different. Hey, here's something.
Yeah.
And it's just people need to be more vocal about the success of doing something different, because
Absolutely.
there's definitely, like, in the LGBT spaces, I noticed that our spaces were kind of in the dark. It was the
Hmm.
nightclubs, it was the spaces where you were hidden in the shadows from the world because that was what was safe
Yeah.
back when it wasn't widely accepted to be a part of that community.
Right.
And the global pandemic has definitely made it to where people have been more willing to step into the light and be seen. But as you can see, there's a lot of resistance
Definitely
when
is.
a community that was in the shadows before is stepping into the light.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, we're going to have to really push hard through this resistance to show people, like, hey, it's okay for you to let us exist in the light.
Right.
We all exist together.
Hmm.
There's nothing to fear about this
Hmm.
community of people. Um, but we're in the part where that's the struggle. And
Uh-huh.
that's, it's not just for the LGBT community. Anything that's different faces that struggle of, this is not normal. You will have people
Hmm.
that would rather normal exist, especially ones who have like power in the
Yes. Any sort of
normal.
benefit from it.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
if you exist in the normal and it benefits you and it just fits very well,
Hmm.
you don't want things to change because you found comfort in a position of power in what is already in
Yeah.
existence.
Oh man, yeah, the conversation of like power and privilege, that's like all its own thing. But I do agree with you that the way that we are creatures of comfort, and I think our inability to then articulate for ourselves what did we actually want to go back to. So in church world, which is how I experienced the pandemic, people really just wanted to be able to gather again. I think that in and of itself, like that is of course beautiful. It's commanded. So nothing wrong with once we were allowed to return to gathering. But there's so many of those little examples of like, can we articulate and isolate what's valuable? And then if not, maybe that's where those differences and those changes should have happened. And I think my own story is like I'm going to call it a tangential byproduct of the pandemic. So I don't in any way say, oh, I'm an actor now because of COVID. And I think it's just because it's a little bit further removed. But at the same time, I would acknowledge, I actually think that it was because of that disruption. I got into different routines, habits, saw what I could be satisfied in different ways. Um, Grew a lot, got a little comfortable more comfortable in my own skin. So there was things that were happening that set the seeds. And I know there's plenty who would point to COVID, and that really was their turning point. I think I feel one step removed.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely of the mind of like grateful for the differences that it wrought. And yes, I wish we had learned our lessons. I wish that we could, yeah, articulate what we really wanted to go back to, but that is wishful thinking.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who has grown a lot, one thing that I've learned is every step that I take, there's a level of comfort I start to get in
Hmm.
that space.
Yeah.
And every time you feel that comfort and you take the next step, it is a completely new space and
Yep.
it is challenging. It's not easy. Like the amount of times where I'm like, oh my God, why did I take another step? Like,
Mm-hmm.
this is even harder than it was last time I took a step. But it's something that I had to get used to,
Yeah.
and the people around me, not everyone stays around when I take those steps because not everybody wants to grow. Not everyone wants to exist in that discomfort. I think that when you think of positions of power, there's not a lot of people up there because
Mm-hmm.
not everyone's cut out for that journey. I do think that there's a lot of voices that do belong up there,
Mm-hmm.
and deserve the support and love of everyone around them to get them there.
Yep.
But it does take a certain type of person to continue to step through the pain, the fear, the unknown
Mm-hmm.
that exists on the other side of every new level you grow in.
Absolutely.
And for me, like, my faith has gotten me through a lot of those
Mm-hmm.
things. Like, in times where I'm just like, you know what? Like, no one from my last step is taking this step with me, but you know what? He's with me.
Amen.
So
There you go.
uh,
Yeah.
he will make sure at this next phase that the right people that I need to grow in this space are there to help me to the next
Mm-hmm.
step.
Absolutely.
And I think that sometimes we strip people of that, and that scares me. That's why I try to show people, like, hey, this is what's gotten me through.
Mm-hmm.
Like, his hand is there if you want it. But I don't try to like force it down anyone's throat of like, you have to do it this way. But I've found that when I've asked for help and I've taken the leap because I trust that he's going to help me land the
Mm-hmm.
jump, that I usually find a space. It's not easy.
Right.
You
Nope.
do,
Not at
you
all.
have to go through the storm,
Yeah.
but it is true that no matter what, you just keep pushing through,
Mm-hmm.
and the things that you need will come into
Yeah.
existence.
That's so well said. I think people don't realize, I guess, unless they've really given it thought, if you're going to take any sort of risk, make a change, be different, that it can be so isolating. And to your points, like let's say when you're struggling, well, your struggles aren't going to be celebrated until after you're successful. I think, for myself, like I have, of course, different dreams and goals as a performer. I also try to temper them by just the joy of like, what is it to be a working actor? But I recognize like it's very isolating right now. And realistically, like, no, I'm not acting at some crazy, crazy high level, right? Like I am a beginner. And so to recognize like, oh, it's going to feel isolating basically every step of the way. Like the maybe grander satisfaction or feeling a little bit more confident in yourself, like that's only going to come later. Um, but I wish someone would have warned me. I think I still would have made the same decision.
Yeah.
But like it can be so isolating, but it's the smaller things, right? Where like it's just, yeah, like maybe you don't relate to other people as much just because of the choices you've made. And that's not good, bad, or otherwise, but you just don't have that same camaraderie. It could be financial. It could, I guess, be spiritual. But same as you, I'm like, thank you, Jesus, that you are the same every day. You're with me. Yes. Um, but yeah, there's an isolation by just being different in any number of ways. And I think that actually part of that is okay to sit in. If we rush that, I think then we start to self-medicate. And sometimes we self-medicate with just like friendships or busyness. Sometimes we'll choose, we'll say more damaging realms. But to sit in it, to recognize that it's there and that it is temporary, that you're going to find your people, you're going to relate to people who, even if they're saying a totally different field, they'll take similar risks. That's something I've noticed where like I don't need to have a million friends who are actors. I actually just need probably like that's why I'm excited for look, you, a new friend where I'm like, oh, I relate to him by just how he wants to get after things and is willing to take a risk, even though what we do is going to be totally different. That to me is a sort of comfort more so than just having a bunch of actor friends.
Yeah. I've told people many times when it comes to my friendship circle, when you look at us as a physical group of people standing in one space, it would be very hard to peg us as like it's this type of person
Mm-hmm.
because outwardly we look very diverse,
Yeah.
but it's the drive, it's the frequency of wanting something better and doing whatever it takes to get there.
Hmm.
The connectiveness that we have with one another is hard to physically see, but when you're in that space, like, you can feel it.
Hmm.
And for me, like, a lot of people found comfort in people who look the same or are
Hmm.
in the same realm of things.
Yeah.
And like you were saying before, I love how you can kind of compare like a job or friends and people to like the more harming substances,
Hmm.
because sometimes those things can be just as harmful, but
Absolutely.
they're not things that we physically look at and go, oh, wow, that's bad. You need to
Hmm.
get yourself out of that.
In fact, it's
Um,
sometimes the opposite, where those things are celebrated, but it might still not be actually helping you.
yeah. I connected with someone that I went to high school with, and
Hmm.
visually, I was like envious of his life because he
Hmm.
was surrounded by people,
Hmm.
and I was kind of this shy kid that didn't really like speak up or have
Hmm.
conversations with people. So I was more of, I hung out with my sisters. That was kind of my life,
Yeah.
and I looked at his life and I was like, man, I would have loved to have had hundreds of friends in
Hmm.
high school that always wanted me to hang out with them. We reconnect as adults, and he was like, man, I wish that I had family like yours
Hmm.
that I could
Wow.
just be with.
Hmm.
And when we started talking, he was like, I felt so alone. I was completely surrounded by all these people,
Hmm.
but I was so alone because I couldn't relate to any of these people. I was hurting and no one could relate to the pain. I couldn't share that.
Wow.
uh, and as adults, we were able to connect with the fact that our childhood, we were looking elsewhere,
Hmm.
and seeing something we wish we had. And to come back around to it, it's like, wow, don't judge people by what you see, because
Hmm.
we're all on journeys that are invisible to others. A lot of times we'll project what we think their life is, because it's the life that we'd hope we could have.
Hmm.
And it causes so much damage because so many people are wondering this world so alone,
Yeah.
when if we just opened up and shared, I'm hurting here, the
Hmm.
amount of
It would do
people around
wonders.
us, it's just like
Oh man.
we could connect, because we don't connect with each other through our perfection image that we try to portray. We
Right.
connect with the human part of everyone, and it's the pain and the trials that we go through that make us connectable
Yep.
pieces to one another. And I mean, the amount of times I've connected with people who have experienced the same pain is a
Hmm.
very healing process, because that alone feeling of thinking that I'm the only one struggling with it
Hmm.
goes away, and it allows you that space to heal.
Yes. I love, yeah, when you have relationships that are close enough with your friends or even a social media connect, it is so comforting when you basically do get to hear their struggles. And I feel badly when I say it, because I'm like, oh, you never want to bask in someone else's misery. And it's not that. But what you described, I remember having that exact conversation with my best friend in Indy years ago. And where I kind of acknowledged to him, like, oh, here's the things I'm envious of in your life. Here's what's hard for me. And then when he opened up, and of course did not repeat verbatim because they were different struggles and desires, but when he said, and he added like what he's envious of in my own life in a way where I would have never envisioned, that was such a source of comfort. It was also such an increase in our unity, like as just friends and in the bond. And yeah, to your points of like being in it with people who are like-minded, I think so for years and years being like a single and celibate gay Christian, I think people would have assumed that I wanted a bunch of other friends who could directly relate to that. And I get it, that makes sense. But really, I didn't feel that I needed a bunch of friends who were just like me. I actually just needed other Christian friends who were really serious about chasing after Jesus, because that was the motive all along for me. It had nothing to do with being told what to do, it had nothing to do with anything, but my motive was this. And so even people who were straight, married, kids, if they were all in, if they were willing to be inconvenienced for what they believed, if they were really willing to deny basically things that they want, that's what super life-giving. And I think we sell ourselves short when we say like, I need people who are very somehow directly connected to me. I'm like, you're just going to rob yourself of some of the best people. And my favorite friendships I'm a big just like friend guy, but my favorite friendships are when you're surprised. So like you meet somebody and maybe you immediately dislike them. They ruffle your feathers and you're like, you're a tool. I've had so many of my best friendships be people that I immediately discounted in first impressions, and then later on when you circle back and get to know them, uh, it just cracks me up. I think we should all like not be so confident in our ability to read people, because like some of my best relationships that have challenged me, encouraged me, sharpened me in all walks of life have come from people that I didn't even immediately think I could be a friend with. So for what that's worth.
I mean, when it came to my Positive Talk series, like I reached out to people that I assumed would not even look at their message and see something and respond.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I really want people to see past what they see on social media with these people,
Yeah.
because with social media, it makes it so easy for us to project whatever story we want onto people that we think have the life that we want, or have a life that maybe we in our head don't think they deserve, or think we deserve it over them. But
Yeah.
then when you speak to them and see them as people, which I love conversations like this, like deeper conversations. I'm not really a shallow water type of conversation type of person.
Yes.
But most people, that's the type of relationship we have with them. But if you give people the opportunity to go deeper, most people are beautiful things that are fully capable of doing it, but not everyone gives you the opportunity to explore that.
Yep.
And as a coach, as someone who does stuff like this is my favorite part. It's just like having those conversations, because I think every person on this earth can unlock new parts of you as a person. Yep. So like my goal is to just keep unlocking new parts of myself, and
love that.
Hopefully
yes.
with people that are watching and coming on to the show, like they're also experiencing the same thing. Because when I first started this was to help people get through the negativity of the pandemic, of the crazy movements that were going on, the political year that we were having in 2020. And then it just kind of kept going. And I was like, you know what? This is like something that really brings joy to my life. I love learning. I don't want it to end.
Absolutely. I'm sure you have said this in your coaching, but I'll just repeat it. That like if you lead out with vulnerability, it is almost always matched. Yeah. But oftentimes people just don't want to be the first. But I mean, I actually, for my own experience, it's a 100%, return. I don't want to promise that to people, but the principle is the same. Where like, if you lead out with vulnerability and open up, not that you need to do that with people who are maybe not trustworthy or blah, blah, blah. But when you do it, people are so willing to respond, because you're right. We're wired to be hungry for that sort of connection. And I'm glad that, yes, social media can go either way. The highlight reel, take it or leave it. But just real connect, real conversations, like that's the stuff that I think when you lay down at night and you reflect on your day, you will point back to that and say, like, that was a real highlight. That mattered. So,
yeah. I see that we're wrapping up to the end of the hour. So I just want to say thank you for jumping on here and doing this. I'm glad we were able to connect. And if there's anything that you'd like to wrap up with, or let people know how they can support you on your journey, feel free to throw that out there.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, we'll keep watching this guy, keep watching the Positive Talks. And yeah, it's been great to connect. Thanks for having me. And I would just say, like, give a follow. If you are of the praying variety, I believe that prayer matters. So I would love prayer for just provision and health and all of those things, but would love to connect. I genuinely enjoy actually talking with people. So if you shoot me a message, I will respond. It's not like I have millions of followers. So I was like, I have time to respond, and I would enjoy getting to know folks.
Yeah, it's definitely, when you start growing, it gets a little harder to keep going out there, but it's still very refreshing to have deep conversations with new people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you, my friend.
Awesome. Well, you have a good rest of your day, and I will talk to you soon.
You too. See you later.
Bye.